Today's program is going to be a little controversial, not because the facts aren't known. What I'm going to tell you today is very well understood in science, and scientists agree on the facts. The reason it's controversial is that many gardeners have a different opinion, and it's going to be hard for me to convince you. So I ask you to do one thing. Listen to the video, think about it. I hope I end up convincing you, but if not, at least you'll understand the subject matter better. I gave a talk a couple days ago and someone came up afterwards and asked me this question. Isn't synthetic fertilizer toxic? And I said, no, it isn't toxic. Although many people believe it's toxic. I think people believe that for two reasons. One reason is that there are a lot of pro-organic groups that promote that idea. They just tell you synthetic fertilizer is toxic, period. And gardeners believe that. The second reason is that you're probably familiar with the fact that if I take a bunch of synthetic fertilizer and I drop it on the lawn, it kills the lawn. It must be toxic. Well, you have to understand that what you've done is you've put a high dose of material on that lawn. And in fact, the reality is that the lawn didn't die because of toxicity. The large amount of fertilizer actually created a really concentrated nutrient solution outside the roots, and that sucked water out of the roots through osmosis. It's certainly true that if you use too much, it will kill the grass. Another person yesterday asked me a similar question. Isn't it easier to harm plants with synthetic fertilizer than organic fertilizer? Well, let's compare a bag of 10-10-10 to compost. And the answer to the question is yes, synthetic fertilizer can harm your plant more easily. But let's think about this. Synthetic fertilizer is a 10-10-10. That means it has 10% nitrogen. That's pretty high. Compost, on the other hand, is probably 0.5% nitrogen. That's 20 times less nitrogen for each handful of material. But there's another important factor here, that in the compost, that nitrogen is mostly tied up in large protein molecules. It's not available to plants. So the amount of actual free nitrogen that would affect a plant is several hundred times lower than what you find in synthetic fertilizer. In synthetic fertilizer, we add a bit of water, dissolves right away, and it's immediately available, all of it. This comes down to a question of dose. If you add too much, it harms plants. But that's true of pretty much everything. How about vitamin C? Is that toxic? Will that harm you? You're probably sitting there saying, well, of course not. We need vitamin C in our diet. And that's true. You need about 95 milligrams a day. It varies a bit depending on your sex and your weight and age and so on. But somewhere around that number. On the other hand, 2,000 milligrams, which you can get from vitamin C tablets, is quite toxic. When we talk about toxicity, it depends on the dose. If you use synthetic fertilizer correctly, you apply the amount you're supposed to apply according to the label instructions, it is not toxic to plants. One of the reasons we know this is that the chemicals inside the fertilizer are identical to the ones that are released by compost. They both make nitrate, phosphate, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and so on. And those ions are identical from both sources. If organic matter is not toxic, well, then neither is synthetic. Another very common myth is that adding synthetic fertilizer to soil will kill the microbes. Again, that's simply not true. One of the reasons we know this is that microbes need those nutrients to live. Nitrate, phosphate, potassium, magnesium, all of those things are essential nutrients for microbes to live. They're also essential for plant growth, and they're essential for you and I. We also need those in our diet. Every living organism needs those nutrients. That's why we know they're not toxic. They're actually necessary in the food chain. So what happens when we go out to a farmer's field and we spread synthetic fertilizer on it? Well, it dissolves in water and becomes available. So now there's these nutrients in the soil, and nutrients are food for microbes. What we have in the field is a pretty steady amount of microbes. Then we add the fertilizer. The fertilizer is food for microbes, so they start to grow. They start to divide. There's more of them. and we get this population spike. Now, at some point, they've used up all this food. They start eating each other. They start dying off. Remember, microbes don't live very long, so they're dying off anyways. And the population comes crashing back down to where it was before. Long term, we haven't really changed the microbe population. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, just a minute. The title of this video suggests that synthetic fertilizer increases microbe populations. How does that come about? Well, the other thing that happens when we add fertilizer to soil is that the plants absorb those nutrients. As they absorb nutrients, they're able to grow bigger. They have bigger leaves, more leaves, they're taller, they're larger. As a result of that, the plant does more photosynthesis. Larger plants do more photosynthesis than smaller ones. In photosynthesis, they're creating a whole bunch of chemicals, mostly sugars and carbohydrates, and collectively we call them photosynthates, things that are made during photosynthesis. And what does the plant do with those? Well, it's used to grow. Makes more roots, makes more leaves. It turns out that plants send about 30% of the chemicals they make in the leaves down to the roots, and they excrete them out the roots. This creates a very special area right around the roots called the rhizosphere. These organic chemicals, the sugars, carbohydrates, amino acids, are being put in this rhizosphere. And guess what happens? The rhizosphere becomes full of microbes. This is food for microbes. So there's a huge explosion in microbes. That organic matter from the plant is actually increasing the microbes in the soil. When we fertilize plants, the nutrients result in plant growth, which increases the amount of photosynthesis, which increases the amount of photosynthates that are put into the soil, which increases the microbe population. So in fact, adding synthetic fertilizer to soil does increase the microbe population in your soil. And once you have more microbes in the soil, you also get better soil structure. So it's improving the soil. It's improving the health of the soil. Now, I'm not suggesting that all gardeners should run out and buy synthetic fertilizer and start spreading it around. I mean, you have to understand that synthetic fertilizer also has an environmental cost because we have to manufacture it. But it is important to understand the process that's taking place. As gardeners, what you want to do is keep adding nutrients into the soil so your plants are growing really well. Now, your best option is organic matter. It's that compost, particularly if you make your own compost, because that has the least environmental impact. If you're going to bring in organic matter to your garden, then the more local it is, the better. So local manure or mushroom compost from the factory down the street. Those are good choices because they don't have to be trucked around very much. And they are a waste product, so we're making good use of that. Now in my own garden, I use mostly organic material. I use very little synthetic fertilizer. I do use synthetic fertilizer for special cases. I use it in containers. I use it in potted plants indoors. And sometimes I use it in my vegetable garden. If my plants aren't doing well and they need a fast feed, because I have a short season, I can't wait too long for my tomatoes to grow, I will use synthetic fertilizer. But I much prefer the organic option. And in the rest of the garden, I use organic fertilizer. It's important to know the benefits of both types of fertilizer and use the appropriate one as needed. The problem I see today is that so many gardeners have such a negative view of synthetic fertilizer. Understand what it is, understand how to use it, and use it appropriately. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the rhizosphere, which is an absolutely fantastic topic, have a look at this video right here. And if you want to learn more about fertilizers, look at this video here. Happy gardening.